This is something I've been looking forward to personally for weeks. I obviously have a lot of things on my plate from day to day, but I've been very excited about this event, and I'm very grateful that Peter's come along to talk here tonight, because there's very few people that have his experience in this really important time of commemoration. When I think about Peter Cundall, I mean, he's a national treasure. But his perspective on life and everything that's made Peter who he is, the way I read it, and we're going to look forward to a bit of banter soon, Peter, that perspective's come from war. It's come from combat, not just service. It's come from your experiences as a soldier and as a veteran confronting the issues that you had to deal with after the war, and that's led to who you are, and that's why I think it's really unique that when we're talking about how we commemorate, which we'll get into in a minute, that we've got Peter here tonight to share his thoughts on this. And a lot of you are probably already aware of Peter's background. He's been a veteran of three different wars, 3 different conflicts. He's been a prisoner of war. He's also been he's been injured and spent months in hospital. Only a minor injury, Peter tells us, but nevertheless, he was hospitalised for months, and he suffered immensely when he came back to civilian life, and openly talks about the loss of his friends and how he dealt with the pain and the hardship. And he works with veterans. He works with veterans groups in this state. I've just initiated a Senate inquiry in the country into post-traumatic stress disorder and how particularly young veterans are being assimilated back into society and all the issues that they're coping with. So this is a really interesting topic tonight that I'd like to discuss with you as well, Peter. So look, like I said, Peter is a living treasure, and I'm very grateful that he's come along here tonight. But I'd now like to introduce you to Peter Cundall, who probably needs no introduction to a lot of you, but I think we all know him as a larger-than-life character, someone who's vivacious, energetic, an activist, one of the most humane people you'll meet. Yet underneath that is this skeleton that we've just talked about. That is certainly out of the closet in your case, Peter, and that is that you're dealing with being a veteran of many wars. Thanks, Peter. Thank you.
Can you hear me all right? You can't hear me all right. Look, it's true that my experience of war, it's not typical, but it's quite common. And like many of you here, from looking at the number of grey heads, I'm not alone. My first experience, oddly enough, was when I was about, 14 years old during the Manchester Blitz, when I volunteered to be what they call an ARP messenger boy, in the Blitz, and that meant you had to report fires and things like that, because I was a bit of I was known as a juvenile delinquent, and it kind of helped to put me on the right path.
I'm shocked.
And I'll never forget my first sight of dead people with a row of them, all neat men, women and children, all lined up in a bit of cleared rubble beside the shattered air raid shelter that had been blown up with a direct hit from a bomb. And I remember thinking, even as a child, how indiscriminate war can be, and how extraordinarily unjust war can be, because these were perfectly innocent people. And it was only later on, during the war, when I joined the British Parachute Regiment, again, like most young blokes who believe they're invincible, and this is the reason why many young men go to war, because of this extraordinary energy that young men in particular have. And they do feel invincible, And they do want, originally, that experience of being there, and they have an almost romanticised view of what war is like. Unfortunately, unfortunately, I went to France, and the war had just finished. And I saw devastated town, city, village, one after the other, right the way through France and Germany and Austria. And at the side of the railway line, as we were travelling, were hundreds of children, starving kids, some playing an accordion or a violin, just begging for our haversack rations. And the soldiers used to throw their sandwiches to the children as we passed. And I remember looking at these kids living in the ruins of where the war had been, and then to confront, and that's the only word, the survivors from the concentration camps, and listened to their stories, their horror stories. And whatever you've heard about the camps and what happened in the concentration camps, what really happened is infinitely worse than the very worst you've ever heard. The way they degraded people. What is never mentioned is how they survived in many cases. They used to eat the dead. But that was a reality. It's never mentioned. And it was, oddly enough, it was even during this period that, like many other young soldiers, it's true I was captured by Tito's partisans, only chasing or with a girl, again that strange yearning that young men have. And they were all virgins, all the soldiers were virgins in those days. And I thought, this is my moment. All my wet dreams have come to pass. But it never happened, because she took me by the hand and led me across the frontier and left me. And I was then, innocently as I was, waiting for her to come back, and she didn't. And I didn't even know I was on the wrong side. I remember walking down a road and coming to a roadblock, a frontier roadblock, and seeing soldiers guarding it in strange uniforms, and I was on the wrong side. And that's when I was given 6 months. I was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment for espionage. I did 6 months solitary, right, which did me no harm, none, well, not one bit. Because with the kind of background I'd had of total poverty, I remember walking into the cell and hearing the door slam and thinking, this is the first room of my own I've ever had. I mean, that's the very essence of optimism. But eventually I was released and immediately posted to another war that nobody ever talks about. And that was the war that occurred in Palestine between 1945 and 1948. It's been virtually removed completely from history. But about 250 or more British soldiers were not just killed, but assassinated, shot in the back, blown up, because we were there to prevent the fanatical Zionists and fanatical Arabs fighting each other, and we were the meat in the sandwich. And I know that I'd only been there a week when two of our sergeants who had been kidnapped by fanatical Zionists had been executed by the Dachau method of hanging, which, if you don't know, was invented in the concentration camp at Dachau when they wanted to demonstrate to the assembled prisoners the punishment for trying to escape was to hang them with a 4-inch drop, so they'd take an hour to die while people watched them. And that's how they executed these two sergeants. And when we went to cut them down, well, they were taken out and left hanging from a eucalyptus tree. And when the officer went to cut them down, what they'd done, they'd cut them open, removed their internal organs and stuffed them with explosives so that when they were cut, that they exploded, causing massive casualties amongst those around. This was a type of brutality that we were exposed to, but we rarely read about it, right? It's just something that occurs. you know, but I was there in that war, and I remember leaving and getting demobbed in 1948 and thinking there's one thing, as long as I'm alive, I never want to see another war. And Australia beckoned, as it did with many people in Britain all those years ago. But there was a huge waiting list. And then somebody pointed to a tiny advert in the paper saying volunteers are wanted for the Australian Army. And I thought, well, it's away from every war. Why not? I went and inquired. They said, what were you in the British Army? And of course I was a fully trained infantry soldier in the parachute regiment. So I said I was a librarian. And they said, that's exactly what we want. We're looking for librarians. Have you ever heard of a place called Bondi? I said, no, I've never heard of Bondi. It's a beach in Sydney, and there's an army library there. It's only open for 2 hours a day. You get Sergeant Frank. I couldn't believe it. I said, where do I sign? And on the boat coming out was about 250 other amazing, naive Poms. I said to one of them, what are you doing? He said, I'm going as an official military photographer. I said, yeah, well, is that what you used to do? He said, oh, no, infantry, but the only thing I've ever had is a brownie box. But whoa, he said, sergeant's rank. Somebody else was going to be an official surveyor. You know, we all had we'd all lied our way. And then when we landed in Melbourne and marched ashore, they say, we've got news for you. You're all in the infantry and you're going to Korea in a couple of weeks' time. And so I finished up in the Korean War. And what is not known about Korea is that it was like World War I. It was trench warfare with massive artillery barrages and millions of aggressive rats and corpses everywhere. It was the most appalling, brutal, shocking war. And I'll never forget the first day I arrived. And we drove to the front line, and somebody took us, a digger came and he said, I will take you to the trenches at the top of the hill. And I remember going up the hill, I could this terrible smell. And then I noticed everywhere were bodies lying face down, mainly Chinese. Some of them were rotting away, and it was interesting. Even my gardener's eyes looked and noted with a kind of a horrified fascination to see that around some of the decaying bodies, green grass, extra bright green, was growing as it fed off the corpse. And I said, why don't they bury them? He said, we can't. Look at them. And many of them were holding grenades still. They couldn't move them in case a grenade went off. And I got to the top of the hill, and they gave me some, what they call sea rations. I remember opening a tin of baked beans, and the smell was overwhelming. And the soil everywhere was black, because the area of the battle that had taken place 3 weeks earlier had been massive. And I sat on a kind of a blackened clod of earth and opened my baked beans, and one of the diggers said, what are the beans like? I said, oh, I can hardly taste them, this terrible smell. And I'm eating away, and I notice a burnt branch in front of me. As I'm looking at it, I suddenly noticed that right on the very tip of the branch were fingernails. It was an arm. And a soldier said, how are the beans again? He was laughing. I said, I can't stand the smell. He said, are you comfortable? I was sitting on a head. I was sitting on a human head and didn't even know it. And in the battle, and it was, in many cases, frontal assault. And this is the thing about young men, of course, when they go there, they're excited because they think, oh, it's something like they've seen in Hollywood or whatever. It only happens once after one battle when you see your mates with his dead, with half the head blown off or the stomach ripped out, or someone screaming there, and they all cried for their mother, you know. They all cry for the only person the only person that ever came to help them when they were in trouble. This is what these big hulking men, 22, 23 years old, they call for their mother, you know, all of them. We're used to that. And there are no brave soldiers in the line, and there are no cowards. They're just those who get used to trying to conquer that terror, that terrible fear that exists, and it goes on night and day. And to be under a massive barrage, right, that will last possibly for an hour, knowing that as soon as it stops, you are immediately, you've got to get out of the hole you're crouching in because there's an attack on. Because a barrage is always followed by an attack. This is what happens, not once, but time and time again. And it's then that they start to say to each other, what are we doing here? Why are we from Australia, or Britain, or New Zealand, or Canada, or Sri Lanka, as they were, or Turkey, right, or America? We start to say, what are we doing here? In this strange land, which we'd never even hardly heard of before, fighting over strange hills. What's it all about? Why are we here? And so the only common question that we used to ask each other was, how long have you got? And we'd say, oh, I've got another 258 days to go, because we had to do a year. I was taken ill in the trenches as a result of the filth, was hospitalised for 3 months, and that meant I would come back, I had to make up that 3 months in the line. But the real strange business about war, and coming back, and I did, left Korea, left what was acres and acres of dead corpses on a hillside, is to come and arrive back in Australia and land in Sydney or Melbourne or elsewhere and find that people have a perfectly normal life. And normality to a returned soldier is a terribly strange, weird thing. It's weird, it's odd. Before I left, there were 4 of us, 4 very, very close mates. And we only had a few weeks in Sydney. I remember we used to run through the Domain and climb the harbour bridge. And there was a little place on the first pylon on the right, there was a little tea room. And we used to go up there, have a cup of tea, then go across and do silly things that young blokes do, go to Luna Park. And we used to meet at the old fig tree that's in the Botanical Gardens. And one of the he fell in love with a beautiful girl that he met, my mate Alf. And that was it. We didn't see him very much from then until we left. Now, I came back. My other mate was killed alongside me as we went in for an attack. You're there, you have no feeling except fear. And it's interesting. I remember looking along the line of us in a trench, and the Chinese were so close we could smell their cooking. And we had to go in and attack them. And I'll never forget, and there's no flags waving, by the way, and there's no whistles blowing like they see on television. It's a quiet word that's passed along. And someone passed it along, we're going over in 5 minutes. And you could see the word being passed down. And this made us laugh, in a way, when, as it passed down, my mate, Frank, nudged me and he said, look at that. And as the word was passed down, the line of these men, half in the mist, and armed with short magazine Lee Enfield rifles, the same as was used in World War I. And I was behind a Mark I Vickers machine gun, exactly the same as the one used in World War I. But as that passed down the line, you could see every man turn round and have a pee. Nervous pee. An instinctive thing. And then as we went over the top, it's weird to move into action, right? Because we were in a mist and suddenly the mist lifted and we were under fire. And when a bullet passes you, it breaks the sound barrier. And so if it's close to your head, you hear an extraordinarily loud crack that makes your head ring, and you know it's dangerous. And this happened to me, I know this, we're moving forward, and then ahead I heard this terrible, terrible gasping noise. And there was my mate Frank lying on his back, his face already shrinking, his feet splayed out almost to the ground. And you don't stop, this is not Hollywood. If you stop, you get killed. You keep going. And when I got eventually there, ready for the next assault on the next hill, somebody came up who knew me and said, look, your mate Frank, he died just as they put him on the stretcher. And what do you feel? A cold feeling and a sense of relief that it wasn't you. This is the strange thing about war. I came back, of the 4 of us that went, I was the only one to come back, the other 3 were killed. And I couldn't go to that old fig tree anymore. I found it too moving. I went to Melbourne and spent an enormous amount of time in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, and to my astonishment found other diggers wandering around too. It was a place of relief, a place of peace and tranquility is what they needed, because they couldn't bear this, everyone going around, going to picnics, going to the beach, swimming, going dancing, right, having a great time. And you're thinking, hang on, my mates are still over there. They're still in it. We've just left hillside after hillside covered with dead people. And you take refuge in a place like that. And I'll never forget that. And I'll never forget that feeling of being almost alien. And you can understand how the soldiers coming back from Iraq or East Timor or Afghanistan or Vietnam, how they feel when they came back and people are normal. And it's not normal, because people are suffering and at risk every moment of their lives. And I know that my vow, and I was still in the army, and I was an instructor of young soldiers, young national servicemen in the 1950s. I turned out more pacifists than any other person. They couldn't believe it, right? I mean, I just said, in effect, you don't volunteer for something just for the glory of it, right? You make sure you keep your head down and your ass up all the time, right? And you never volunteer, and you never take it the hard way, and you make sure you survive. Because I learned from even my studies of World War I, for example, the 1st 16th West Australian Battalion, Infantry Battalion, the Australians, were wiped out 5 times during that war. But the survivors were often the experienced ones that were still there in 1915 and had survived because they knew how to survive. And the casualties were quite often the ones that were naive. And I remember that the young recruits would arrive in Korea. Yeah, I remember a young man coming there and said, oh boy, have I been waiting for this. Oh, I've been waiting for this ever since. Where are they, Pete? Where are they? And I said, can I have a go at the machine gun? I said, what at? He said, I just want to have a go, mate. Oh boy, have I been waiting for this. And just then, a shell came in, and there was a terrible screaming noise, and a man was carried past with his guts hanging out, dying. And I stopped because I had to shove his stomach back in. It was dragging along in the dirt. And he looked at me, this bloke who I knew, and wonderful kid, 21 years old. And he said, oh, I'm getting out of this, Pete. And he didn't know how badly he'd been wounded. And then he put his hands down and he felt what was left of his stomach, and he knew he was going. And he said, oh, I think I've had it, mate. And he died. In front of me. I thought, what a waste, what a waste. And I'll never forget picking up a newspaper that somebody had sent me, mainly to look at some local news item, but I turned to another side, which was the business section, which I never read as a rule. And there was a headline saying, because we were in sight of Panmunjom where the peace talks were taking place. It was a neutral zone. And at night time it was outlined by 4 vertical searchlights. And we used to look at this just about 10 or 15 kilometres ahead, these 4 searchlights at night, and thinking, because there's no greater peace lover than a soldier in the line, if only they will come to an agreement. And then I opened the paper and found that Wall Street investors groaned at further news of peace talks. And I thought, who are these people that benefit so much from war? And in the essence of war, right, the very essence of war and what it's all about, without question, it's based on greed, on money, on power, and control. That's what it's all about. And have you ever noticed, as you must, that the ones who send young men and women to war are never the ones that go themselves? How many people can remember the Vietnam War when they introduced conscription? And immediately, hordes of the sons of mainly of Liberal and Labour Party ministers suddenly went to the United States to study. I'll never forget that, right? They went over there. And I remember the Labour Party starting to make a song and dance about it, until they found out that Kim Beazley was one, right? And he went over there. And so, right now, if you read your opinion columnists, particularly in the Australian, and also in the Sydney Morning Herald, they're the same ones. They've never made sure they've never put on a uniform, right? As one said the other night, Greg Sheridan, a few weeks ago on Q&A, I think it was, I've never had a uniform on, he says, but you know, whenever I see an Australian, I say, good on you, mate. And I think, yes, that'd be right, you know, and that's it. It's the hypocrisy of it. And here we are, right now, with Anzac Day happening in a couple of days' time, when the papers are filled with it to such on the television and the radio, so that the commercial broadcasters are now saying, look, are we overdoing it? It's not selling adverts the same as it did. Right, they're actually asking about that. And right in the middle of this, we have a Prime Minister and a Defence Minister that's just sent 300 more young men across to Iraq, and use their departure as a photo opportunity, just as so when they come back dead, they'll be there at the funeral with a long, mournful face, using that funeral as another photo opportunity. You know, don't forget during the Vietnam War that many of the wives of those killed and in Afghanistan were not invited in case they made a bit of a stir. I don't know you knew that, right? And in the First World War, remember this, I've never met a soldier that's been in action and seen war that would support war. The only people that glorify war are those that have never been. And the only soldiers that seem to support war are generals and brigadiers. And I was talking earlier to Peter about the great battle of Manet's Wood. That's one of the great battles, one of many on the First World War, when the whole Welsh division of young men, only 18, many of them 17 years old, went in the face of not one, but dozens and dozens of machine gun nests, and were slaughtered with more than 4,500 killed in 4 hours. And they did it again and again, they were sent in, till eventually they withdrew. So what did Lord Haig, the general in command, do? He sacked that divisional commander and put another one in charge of what was left of that division, saying, you can do what you like with this lot. That was the type of feeling that went on amongst the ruling elite in Britain. And of course, it was absolutely astonishing how those that never went, right, were the most fervent supporters of the war. And that's where the great war poets came out, in opposition to the jingoistic war poets that were also springing up in Britain, right? So my attitude is quite simple. I'm totally opposed to the futility and the obscenity of war. I'll never stop fighting against a war. When the Vietnam War started, there was a fair amount of excitement. In Launceston, like a naive fool, I put a little advert in the Examiner saying, "Rally against troops going to Vietnam." And I went to Princess Square, and I was the only one to turn up. And I walked down South Street carrying a sign saying, "Bring our soldiers home," right? Shaking like a leaf, because I felt so conspicuous, people looking at who is this strange person. But it is true that the development and the emotions against that war, right, developed when they realised just what was going on and the horrors of what the men in Vietnam, they're still suffering. I'm running these special garden workshops, as Peter mentioned, and they're coming out of the woodwork, you know, these blokes, because they shouldn't be, but they're ashamed of what they're going through. And some of them are going through absolute hell. But they're also finding, I had a letter from one today from Queensland, who wrote to me, and he found extraordinary relief in going out. He built a garden for his mother. He went out and he said, "I suddenly found all my fears." He used to wake up at night screaming. You know, he thought he was on the day. Even now, isn't it strange that I can drive down to Hobart, and there's a place just beyond Oatlands where you pass between two hills. It's a valley, and there's a rest area there. You must know it. I always enter that with a feeling still of fear. It's an ambush point. And if you've ever been ambushed, you never forget it. And you find yourself, even 60 years later, you find yourself looking around. Isn't it weird and strange? It never goes away. And I believe that the greatest opponents of war are people like myself that have been there and seen it and seen the horror of it. And above all, the waste of it all. Because the men that died, the cream of a generation, was slaughtered for nothing, right? And that's why I'll never stop fighting against war. As long as I live, I'll never ever stop fighting. Whenever there's any demonstration, I'll never stop fighting.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Peter. I was certainly very moved. It's occurred to me that in this Anzac commemoration that we have now, the 100-year commemoration, what do you make of the word commemoration? What do you think of when Anzac Day or Remembrance Day comes around? What's the first thing that you think about?
I started to worry when it started to develop, because I thought they were going to start glorifying war. And they are tempted. They are talking about how the Australian soldiers, you know, we're the greatest soldiers of all, right? We're the bravest of them all. Other nations envy the Australian soldier. I should mention this, that the Australian 3rd Battalion, which I joined, you've never seen anything more like the United Nations. My platoon commander, for example, a most wonderful man, he was the first Australian Aboriginal officer, Red Saunders, a marvellous, wonderful, kind and generous man. The second in command of the company were from Sweden. 50% of the machine gun platoon were Pongs. 100% of the assault pioneer platoon, everyone, believe it or not, was Scotsmen, came from Glasgow. We laughed because we could never understand what they were talking about. Right? And up there was people in the other companies from Malta, from Slovenia, from Serbia, from France. In fact, the officer commanding the mortar platoon was French. In fact, he went across to the French Canadians next door. He said, "I must have a talk to them. I've never met." And he came back. He said, "I can't understand them. They speak medieval French." I didn't know that, and he didn't know either. And so, basically, it was the United Nations. The thing I'm trying to say is that they're all the same. And if there's one thing that we're talking about, the Anzac spirit, what it is basically is what you come back with, and what happens while you're in the line and in this danger is your absolute and total dependence on your mates. And there's a kind of a bond that develops which lasts for the rest of your life. It's so powerful. And if you go away or are taken out for some reason, you feel you've left a gap. You've left a gap, and that's why the real reason why they go back. Not because soldiers are not ideologies. Right? They don't have an ideology. When we captured Chinese prisoners, and I was in the Australian Battalion, I couldn't get over, and I agreed with them, how carefully and how we looked after them and gave them cups of tea and cigarettes if they wanted them. Right? I mean, we treated them with enormous, simply because we knew that they were going through the same as we were going through. And it's well known in war that the further back prisoners are taken after they've been captured, the worse they're treated. But they're always treated with enormous respect and honour in the line itself. So today, we've got these anniversary coming up, it's 100. My fear, and it is a fear, is that when it's all over, people will be so sick of it that they'll forget, right? Because every soldier that's been in a war and any returns never forgets. It's not one day of the year. Every day, I have an incredibly clear flashback of some incident that occurred. It's normal. And so every day, and I think of my mates every day. Every day. The ones that left, the ones that are still lying in graves overseas in another country, right? And the skeletons are the skeletons of young men of 22, 23. As they say, they never go old. They don't grow like me with grey hair and old geezer, right? They're just young men still lying there in their graves. And when I saw my friend dying, he was surrounded by two dead Chinese and one dying. And I thought, look at that. As I'm running past, they've got a strange sort of unity. There's no more war between these four men. They've got this awful unity in death. And I don't want to ever see that or experience that again.
Peter, the late Governor Peter Underwood said that Anzac is in danger of becoming what he called a soft focus event, and it's losing its hard edges. And by hard edges, he meant the veterans that were still here to talk about the horrors of war, such as yourself, the impacts that the families had felt of post-traumatic stress disorder and all the various problems with mental illness from wars, and that recently a lot of that is now gone, and we're now seeing the trivialisation and commercialisation and politicisation of what is Anzac. How do we get the message across on Anzac Day that war's not something to be glorified or celebrated?
You get the message across by telling the truth, the painful truth. You might remember that when Peter Underwood made that incredible speech, he was immediately attacked. He was immediately attacked by people, in many cases, who had never been anywhere or seen anything, right? But he was under attack. What he did, he broke a kind of a rule, right? And I'll never forget the letters that appeared in the paper. Fortunately, most of those that did listen and hear what he had to say approved. And now, those people that were strongly criticising him have fallen silent. They're outnumbered, So how can you get it across? Look, the only way, right, you do the unthinkable. You do the things that you don't really want to do. You get out in the street, and if necessary, you walk along the street and you hold up a sign and you're saying, I'm opposed to this. Not in my name. Not in my name. Right? You expose them at every opportunity. You don't let them get away with it. Right? What they've done, they've adapted things. It was the first time I went to an Anzac ceremony was 1951 in Liverpool in Sydney. And it was addressed by a little fat politician. And all it was Cold War rhetoric. And he was and for years it happened. And even the RSL was engaged in that. I might add that when we returned from Korea and went to go into the RSL, they wouldn't let us in because it's not a proper war, right? some little fat bugger was there who would know. And the same from the fellas from Vietnam. They wouldn't let them in the RSL because it's not a proper war, right? But so what do? You fight back at every opportunity. Whenever they bub up, you actually sit down, and if you can't write a letter, you help to compose a letter with somebody to the paper and oppose it. And if there's a struggle or a campaign against a war, you don't only go yourself, you get everybody that you know and ask them to come along too. The only way to stop a war, don't forget that the Vietnam War came to an end. It's true that the so-called Western Allies were defeated, but they were defeated, they withdrew because of the massive campaigns in Britain, Australia, the United States, everywhere. Huge campaigns that were getting stronger and stronger. And then, when the trade union movement of Britain, Australia and the United States decided to have a kind of a general united front, all of them, that's what did it. They were going to have an international stoppage. That's what did it. In other words, there's nothing that can beat the extraordinary power of people when they're united together and determined. They are irresistible, right? They cannot be stopped, but if you've got to do it, and they'll do anything to split you up.
One thing I've noticed about the commemoration, is certainly in the last 12 months, is even searching the ABC, who's done a very good job covering lots of different aspects of the 100-year commemoration. I can't find any focus at all on the causes of World War I. We often talk a lot about World War II, and our kids kids have already learned about World War II at school. And interestingly enough, the rhetoric that the government uses to justify going into Iraq, they often bring up the silencing the Nazis and how necessary that was. But let's not beat around the bush on that one. There's a lot of truth to that, but it just fascinates me that no one's ever talked about the causes of World War I. I want to read a quote from a book that I've quoted in my speech, which summarised 100 years of research on the causes. He's a British historian called Paul Ham, and he said in his book's conclusion, World War I was an avoidable nightmare, an unnecessary exercise in collective stupidity and callousness launched by profoundly flawed and emotionally unintelligent men that determined the direction of the 20th century. Has anything changed in terms of warfare?
They've become more skilled these days. These days don't forget, during World War I, when the young people went into the war, the young men, they went in singing a very popular song, which was, oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we've got plum and apple jam? It was a jingoism. You don't get that anymore. They're now finding it's more difficult to get recruits, and so they're almost gloating about the amount of unemployment's around, right? They're after recruits now, they're doing that, right? So it's not quite the same now. They're not getting away with the same rhetoric again on Anzac Day, right, as it did in the past. It's not working. They're trying different. What they're doing now, they're using a different angle. They're saying, as I mentioned earlier, that, the Australians, they're using a kind of nationalism. Australians make the greatest soldiers on earth. We are the bravest, right? I can assure you there is no difference, right? But that we've got to counter that, right? We've got to counter that. And the most powerful weapon of all is the truth, and it's hard to find the truth. It's difficult to find it, because remember that the very people that won war control the media to a large extent, right? A very, very powerful forces control the media. You've only got to pick up the Australian and read the opinion pages. And basically, you can see there's about 8 or 9 opinion columnists who literally are foaming at the mouth in their support for any war, and the way that they could utilise a kind of pseudo-patriotism to try and get people to forget. It didn't satisfy me and a few others. I think, how on earth can somebody being killed in Sarajevo, even if it was a member of the European royal family, how can that start this incredible bloody conflict that went on and on and on with millions slaughtered? Right? And if you look at the reasons and think about what really happened, right, and think about what was said during the war, don't forget that the real reasons for World War I are still locked away. They're unavailable, they are secret documents. Did you know that? They are secret documents. And it was only when Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, in 1916, when he took over, when he read the documents, he made this extraordinary statement, right, that's since been distorted. But what he said, this is horrible, this is terrible, I've just read and found out the real reason for this war. And if the people of Britain and Germany and France knew what this war was really all about, they would stop it tomorrow. It is too horrible. And you think, well, what was it? And I can tell you what I've read, is that in 1913, before the war started in 1914, in Britain and France and in Germany, there was an incredible wave of industrial strikes by trade unions, by socialists, by anarchists, right? It was happening on a huge scale. And if you read the history before that, you could hear the voices coming from Europe and Britain saying, what we're going to have, how can we overcome this? What we need is a good war. What we need is a good war. And they got one. They got one because the leader of there was going to be the very first international strike I think it was on the 25th of July 1914. And the leader in France, somebody came into a cafe where he was. It was an international strike between German, French and British ordinary industrial workers. We're going to have an international, the very first one. Somebody came in and shot him through the head. And 2 days later, the war was declared and all the jingoism started. And that was the end of it. That was the end of it because people became enwrapped in patriotism. We've got to go, we've got to support our people. Right? That's why I saw, that's what it was about. It was about literally diverting people from what they wanted to do for better standards of living. Don't forget, in 1926, when there was a general strike in Britain, the British Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, said the only way to deal with the strikers is to turn the machine guns on them. He said that in the same way in 1924 when he was talking about the Kurds in Kurdistan, who were also causing trouble. We must drop poison gas on them. That'll fix them.
He did actually gas the Kurds.
Yeah, incredible.
Which is the same thing Saddam Hussein did later, which is interestingly a justification for invading Iraq. I think very few people are aware that Winston Churchill actually did gas the Kurds, the same as Saddam Hussein. Anyway, there you go. Peter, I'm interested in your work with post-traumatic stress disorder and how you found solace in gardening. It was something really simple. I've recently read that young veterans from Iraq in the US have been given an hour a day minimum to train a parrot, and it's had amazing impacts on their recovery. And I'm also fascinated in stories about veterans from World War I who developed very close bonds with animals. In fact, Hitler was supposed to have had a small Jack Russell that he was highly protective of, and of course became a vegetarian because of his love for animals. What is it about nature and war, this interesting connection between dealing with the horrors of war and nature?
Yeah. I mentioned about my own childhood earlier. I was born in 1927. That meant it was 9 years after the end of World War I, and that meant I grew up virtually surrounded by veterans, many of them suffering dreadfully. And in fact, I remember there used to be allotments, like little gardens that were allocated. You used to pay $1 a year for them. And I used to say, I remember going to my mother one day, because I used to go to the allotments and get bits of rhubarb and stuff like that, and also talk to them and learn about growing things. And I remember saying to my mother, why is it that these men with the allotments, why is it they never talk? And she said, oh Peter, they're shell-shocked. They're all shell-shocked, and that's the only release they get. And this is true. When you go into a garden, you are in a place of absolute security. You're in a place where you know what's going to happen. When you sow seeds, you know that within a couple of weeks they're going to come up and germinate. When you plant a tree, an apple tree or a pear or any fruit tree, you'll know that in time it will grow. There's a certainty about it. But there's also the most extraordinary relief you get, and it sounds strange this, by working the soil, by actually digging and cultivating the soil and enriching the soil and using all sorts of natural methods. Right, and this is what I've found, and I mentioned earlier that my friend up in Queensland, when he built a garden for his mother, and it triggered off, and I'd started this other workshops here in Tasmania as a result of that. And what we're trying to do is develop not just gardens, or get them into gardening in their own gardens, but also we invited them along, not to say, at Tresca, just exit to there. We had the first one there, one at the Royal Tasmanian Botanical Gardens. I did one on the East Coast, only last October, right? And they do come out of the wood, but what we did, we invited not just the people that had returned, and that included police and United Nations personnel and anyone that had been in a war zone, and their families. And their family, their wives and their children, because a lot of people don't realise that when these men are suffering, it's their families are suffering as a result of what they're going through, right? They're often getting stuck into the grub, they're waking up at night, they're screaming, they want to be on their own, they lock themselves up in rooms, right? They do all these strange things, right? And all they want, right, is to find some kind of peace. And oddly enough, one of the ways is by actually growing things. So that now they're developing at Inaugural Barracks in Brisbane, that the department have given us some land. So we're now going to have a community food garden for vets, right? And another one on New South Wales, right? But amazingly, when you look at what's happening, in the United States they're finding the same thing. They're now, actually, as you've discovered, there's all over the United States, they're finding that men that return from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan and other wars, they're actually putting them into places where they can grow things, or in the country, even working on farms and things like that. It's happening in Britain, it's happening in Denmark where they're leading the way, right? It's happening in Germany and France. Right? In other words, it's a kind of a worldwide movement of growing things, and if possible, to make it in the form of a community garden, so they can get together on a regular basis, not just meet every Anzac Day and exchange ideas and have a good time. And don't forget that when soldiers and ex-servicemen meet on Anzac Day, they don't talk about the war. They talk about themselves and they embrace each other because they never forget their loyalty. They're getting together now on a weekly or even twice weekly basis at these places. And that's the power of healing. It's absolutely incredible, and it does work.
Thanks, Peter. I've just got a couple more questions that I'll throw open to the audience. I was just interested in your view that we have in this country, and I think it's probably unique in the world, the way we celebrate. Don't use that word easily. The way we sort of celebrate Anzac Day or commemorate.
It's commemorate.
Commemorate, celebrate. Unfortunately, I've looked up the word commemorate in lots of different dictionaries, and there's about 40 words you can describe to including celebrate. I strictly don't use that
They used to say celebrate, but that's how it's been
respect,
altered.
Remember,
it's commemoration now.
Commemorate, respect, remember. It's interesting that we're one of the few countries in the world that tends to have this idea that it's our national identity. But few Australians, you talked about the split in Vietnam after a while, but once again, it's very hard to find anything in the commemoration over the last 12 months that talks about the fact that our country was deeply divided during World War I. In fact, the conscription in 1916 tore the nation apart, and we're still divided over foreign wars. Having had the experience of being British and coming to become Australian, do you think it's an odd quirk of our nationality that we use a failed military campaign to sort of talk about the birth of our nation that brought us together?
Australia became a nation, a federation. That's when it started. But they had to use an excuse for the extraordinary defeat at Gallipoli. And what they did, I mean, remember, we're dealing with people that are highly skilled at manipulating the opinions of people. So they made Gallipoli, saying this was the birth of Australia. This is when Australia became a nation. And it was never true. And I think most of the diggers who came back from there agreed it was never true. We became a nation, right? When we became a nation in 1900, right, a federation, that's when we had our constitution. Right, that's when it happened, but it's been transferred to this, and somehow it's always been part of nationalism, particularly with the political right to utilise military and military experiences and military so-called victories, right, or military heroism as a form of nationalism. It's always been the case. Right, Hitler did that with enormous success. And I mentioned about my opposition to war, and I must say this, that the Second World War, we were under attack and had to respond. We had to respond. But if ever there was a war that was avoidable, it was that. Remember that the genesis of World War II and the rise of Adolf Hitler was what happened in 1919 with the incredible, cruel treatment that the defeated Germany had. They were not only humiliated, they had everything taken off them, and the place was in absolute chaos. Hitler and those around him who formed the first Nazi party, which was called in those days the Freikorps, right? And it was saying, why did the war stop? We were betrayed by our own leaders, right? And it was Hitler and people like Hitler that were able to utilise that national shame, embarrassment and humiliation to develop that kind of incredible fervour, because there was no question about the fervour for Nazism that did occur. If anybody's been to Nuremberg, right, and go there, you can see, fortunately to the credit of the local government around Nuremberg, they've kept the site of the great rallies as they were, and now they're still there, absolutely festooned with weeds. You know, these great blocks of concrete covered in weeds, and it's appropriate that that's a form of commemoration. But the thing is that's what they've used. They always use military and so-called courage and heroism for political ends. Always have, always will. We saw that with the speech made by the Prime Minister as to these 300 diggers going to Iraq, when he said exactly the same thing. Right. And when they come back, he'll be standing over the grave or at the funeral of some of the soldiers who may be killed, saying the same thing. Heroism, bravery, typical Australian, long live Australia, this is what we're all about. We're not. Now, I mentioned I was guarding ex-concentration camp guards. A lot of people don't know, and you should know, that the guards around Auschwitz and Treblinka were not German, they were Western Ukrainians. They're the ones that recently seized power in Kiev. Our allies, right, carrying fascist flags. They were the ones, if you look at the war scenes, when the Nazis invaded the Ukraine, they were lining the streets waving flags. When you look at the slaughter of the Jews in the Ukraine, at Babi Yar, where 35,000 men, women and children, whose only crime was to be a Jew, were slaughtered. The slaughtering was carried out by Western Ukrainians. And when I asked the Ukrainians that I was guarding, why? is we hate the Jews because of what they did to Jesus. You know, it was a religious thing. I mean, it was horrible. But oddly enough, the Orthodox Christians, right, from Russia, and I was amazed to meet the Red Army people in Vienna and met a group of these soldiers. What amazed me, and would amaze you when I tell you, that every one of them was deeply religious. I could not believe they were singing hymns, right? And in fact, they were getting drunk while they were singing hymns. And not only that, and I must tell you that that when they were singing hymns and getting drunk and I was with them, in came two members of the Red Army military police. Giants. Women. They were women with short skirts, jack boots, and they just grabbed them and dragged them out and threw them in the back of the truck and came back for me. And I remember being dragged out, surrounded by giant thighs. I'm feeling a strange, perverse joy. And thinking, why am I enjoying this? And also thinking, please don't be hard on me. I said, hopefully. I mean, these are the things that happen, you know. But the most of those we guarded, don't forget that the German concentration guards were given the choice, go to the Eastern Front, or the front, or be a guard, right? And so many of the guards were those that didn't want to go to war. They were a different time. Many of them were criminals. Don't forget the concentration camps were not only for politicals and Jews and homosexuals and Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and gypsies. Don't forget when you talk about gypsies, there was a Holocaust. But it was a Holocaust for the gypsies too. They were virtually wiped out in Europe, did you know? They went out and shot them, right? When the guards at Auschwitz told me that when a gypsy train came in, they dreaded it because they fought every bit of the way. Whereas the Jews came off and did as they were told, you go this way, you go that way. Because a lot of people never mention the fact that in Hungary in particular, but also in Czechoslovakia and in Poland, the Judenrat, now that is the Jewish council that was appointed by the Nazi regime, right? In Hungary, they did a deal with the Germans to tell the Jews of Hungary to report with their cases to the railway station to be resettled in the east. And they knew what was going to happen to them, but the Jews didn't. And then they were allowed to go out to go to Palestine. And they were put on trial in Palestine in 1947, right, and found guilty. And then because the repercussions spread throughout the world, they were retried and found not guilty. Right? These were the leaders. And then they were assassinated by Hungarian Jews. That's what happened, right? But the people in the camps, this brutality, right? Some people are like that. One of the very worst of the concentration camps, there were two, and the very worst were the British ones. The interrogation centres in Germany, and the other one known as the London Cage, where they were absolutely brutal. They came to our unit looking for the most brutal men to actually guard what was originally suspected Nazis, but then became, as the Cold War developed, suspected communists. And their treatment was quite normal. They broke them down quite simply. It was a bathhouse, concrete bathhouses, right? And they simply, in the middle of one of the coldest winters, without any blanket, right, naked in the cell. And on the hour, the sentry went in and threw a bucket of icy water over them. Every hour, day in, day out, right? That was British. So brutality is not something that's nationalistic. It's not something Germanic, right, or anything else. It's something that people can be trained to do or encouraged to do. Right, and they can pick out the most brutal. And so what I saw amongst the prisoners that I guarded was not, when we see Hollywood films or any films about the concentration camp, they're men in shiny boots and beautifully dressed, you know, with wonderful hats and epaulets and everything else. In fact, these were some of the scruffiest lowest creatures I've ever come across. Cowardly, who betrayed each other. And I'll never forget standing around, I smoked at the time, we were issued with 50 cigarettes a day. I remember smoking and throwing my cigarette and watching a group of them, to my horror, fighting over my cigarette end. The official term for them, if you like, is the lumpen proletariat. The lowest of the very low, and they were the ones that were there. And we've got them here. We saw them demonstrated to, what was it, Reprieve Australia or Save Australia. We saw them there, these shaven-headed thugs, right, that were there. You'll get them anywhere, right? And so it's not a national thing, and it wasn't a Germanic thing.
The fellows who fought the battles in Vietnam, when they came back to Australia, they had to fight another dreadful battle here, didn't they? Would you care to elaborate on that?
Yes, I will. For those people on the political right, because they'd been defeated, that treated them roughly. I went to the United States in 1974. I won a Churchill Fellowship to look at gardening, so I was travelling on my own. I went to Washington. I remember going to the White House, and there was a demonstration there. And I looked, and it was these men were marching up and down with signs, and they were asking for proper repatriation benefits. They were Vietnam veterans. And I remember going there and saying, look, do you mind if I photograph you? They said, go ahead, man. And do you mind if I walk with you? And I walked up and down with them. In America, you can't stand and demonstrate, you've got to keep moving. So you go round in circles all the time. And that was it. And they told me that when they come back, they were treated by the government, right, and particularly by the right wing of the Republican Party, as if they were some kind of criminal, as if they'd done something wrong, not because of what happened in Vietnam, but because they'd lost the war. And oddly enough, 3 weeks later, I was in Boston, walking across Boston Common, which is a park. And it was in May, and all the tulips were out, and I went there to photograph the tulips. And I noticed all over the park, groups of men just sitting there, rather sinister looking, I thought, drinking beer and just talking amongst themselves. And while I was walking down the path with my camera, 2 huge men got up, looked at me and walked and came up to me. I thought, here's trouble. And one of them said, hey, have you got some cigarettes, man? I said, well, no, I don't smoke. Are you going to give us some money? So I said, well, I'm a visitor here. Are you a foreigner? I said, yes, I am. I'm travelling. I said, I've only got about $2 on me. And one of them said, that's a mighty fine camera you got there. Are you going to give us that camera? Because we'll take it, but when we take it, it'll really hurt you. And I thought, here's my beautiful camera that I'd saved up to buy. And as I started to take it off to give them, because you never argue, one of the men that was sitting down said, hey, leave that guy alone. He was on the demonstration at the White House with us last week. Really happened, you know. But all they wanted to do, then I went and sat with them and they poured out their stories. They were all suffering dreadfully. They were saying to me, you've no idea what we had to do over there. You've no idea how we suffered, but also you've no idea what we had to put up with when we came back, mainly from the people of the extreme political right who regarded us failures. But we were welcomed back by the peace movement, and that has to be proclaimed. It was the peace movement in Australia and Britain and America that welcomed back the soldiers that came back and the others that came back from Vietnam. I've never heard any of them. I've heard them say, look, when we were coming in the harbour on a boat, coming back from Vietnam, there was a peace demonstration taking place. One of my friends said that. He said, I was disgusted until I saw the signs. Some of them said, welcome home, and bring all of our troops home, stop the war, you know. So he said we felt different. So you'll get some reports that say that they were badly treated, but never by the peace movement.
My brother served in Vietnam. He was one of the very first national servicemen called up in 1965. And he, his experience was that when he came back from Vietnam, he flew in, you know, he'd been in the jungle and lifted out by helicopter and taken to the airport, put on a plane, back in the lounge within 24 hours. And I remember him being very, very edgy, very, very jumpy, you know. You could say bird, he would jump, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's very, very difficult. But the point I'm making is that he went to the RSL Club, the local RSL Club.
Yeah, we all did. Say, go away.
He was one of the very first to come back from Vietnam, you know. And that, some of those, he got, the story I heard is that they said to him, that's not a war, you know, you get lifted out in helicopters, what are you doing, you know, you're kind of soft, you know. And he was very bitter about that. And I wondered whether, you know, there's some sort of comparison between wars, you know, like today, I know he certainly got post-traumatic stress disorder, big time, because, you know, and I just wonder whether there's any gradations from different conflicts.
Just before you answer, Brett, I'll also add to that. I found it really interesting working with veterans groups, particularly younger veterans groups, the disconnect they have to the RSL as well. Very few of them go to the RSL, even on Anzac Day. So this is Afghanistan, mostly Afghanistan vets.
Unfortunately, things are changing, you know. But it's true. I mean, when I come back from Korea, and we say, let's go down the RSL. Wow, you know, I would just have a drink, have a beer, and they wouldn't let you in. They said it's not a proper war, right? And so when you look at the comparison with wars, all wars, every war, even the smallest war, is brutal, is obscene, and is avoidable. That's the most important part. They are all avoidable, right? And they're all based, as I said earlier, on greed and control. Basically, that's what it's all. Money, greed and control. I got no kick when I was in Korea, for example, of finding out that the barbed wire we were using, the bloke who was manufacturing it, who started the manufacture, had become a multi-millionaire in 6 months. You know, just through manufacturing that barbed wire. And we got no kick out of that at all, right? The only people who want war and benefit from war are those that profiteer from war. And that's the arms industry, the military industry. I mean, right now, as you know, there's been a bit of a campaign about whether the submarines, our Australian submarines, should be built in South Australia or built in Japan. And there's all sorts of kind of shifty-eyed movements going on. But nobody seems to be saying, although you do probably, what the hell do we want to spend billions on submarines? I mean, who against? Are we going to be attacked by China? If we are, wouldn't half a dozen submarines be much good anyway? You know? And but this is it, right? Money is a thing that talks in war. Money is extraordinarily powerful, and the urge for profit is ruthless. And war is extraordinarily lucrative.
I might just before Bob, I go to you, just quickly add also, I've written to all the veterans groups around the country, and it got good national media at the time. The issue that the three biggest weapons companies in the world opened their offices in Australia late last year, and they all used the War Memorial to launch their Australian operations. They actually used the Memorial Hall to have their big parties. And one of them, when I asked why the Australian government was allowing weapons companies to sponsor the War Memorial, they said, well, they don't have enough money, so that basically they'll take corporate donations and they can rent it out. And then we found out the example they wrote back to me with was that they'd actually sponsored an exhibition put on by veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder who have severe physical injuries from Afghanistan. This weapons company sponsored this exhibition on physical injuries that was at the War Memorial. I mean, I use the example of the media. It's a bit like cigarette companies launching a new product in a cancer ward. I just find that really offensive, and I think most Australians have as well. So, I actually think you're on, pardon the pun, I think you're on money there. But, Bob?
My background is I never went to war, but I'm collateral damage 20 years worth of collateral damage. My father went off to the islands, New Guinea, Rabaul in New Britain, never spoke of what happened there. But when he came back, he was like the hundreds of thousands of servicemen that came back broken. If they were physically broken, lame, legless, armless, blind, people understood. But mentally, that was a different story. And when you're 6 years old and you're peering out the curtains night after night, just waiting for him to return home, full as a ghoul, fearful of what beating you and your mother are going to get that night again, over and over again, year after year. What did the Australian government and the service and the various services available? There weren't services available. The best times we ever had is when he was carted off to Royal Derwent Hospital and Millbrook Rise Hospital over and over again. The day of the year we hated was Anzac Day because we knew that was going to be a particularly hard night. There are hundreds of thousands of widows, most of them now dead from World War II. Most of the diggers are dead. I wrote to successive governments saying, what are you going to do to address this? One MP actually returned my documents, didn't want to know about it. The others did nothing. I had an abusive response to a phone call to Vets Affairs in Canberra. Out there, at least now, people like the Vietnam vets and their families are starting to be recognised that that's an important thing. But the World War II people, there are still people my age, 60 plus, who are still living with up to 20 years of it. And I tell you, people wonder why I have a very forceful character. It's there because I had to. I got through because I was born, thankfully, intelligent and got scholarships and was able to go through university. Two of my siblings didn't make it.
You know, when you mentioned about your father not speaking about the war, this is the problem, you know, in many ways. This is what I've been trying to say to the vets who come back. You've got to talk about it. You've got to talk about, you see, there's a kind of a culture which says, we mustn't talk about it. You've heard me tonight. I'm talking about it, right? I will, right? But they don't talk about it because we've got this silly, ridiculous culture, right? It's almost as if they feel that somehow they're boasting, and they're not. You're talking about reality, what's happened, right? And if you can get these people to talk about it, it becomes the most extraordinary release. I'll give you an example. Quite weird, because years ago, only about 5 or 10 years ago, there was a bloke who came back from Vietnam. I didn't know that, but he made a garden. And then he entered into the Gardening Australia magazine's gardening competition for the best gardener of the year. Right, we call it the Gardener of the Year. And I looked at all, and I was a judge, and I was looking at all the different ones that were, all the gardens. And then I saw this bloke, Mike, from Queensland, who had built 4 acres of magnificent garden. And I said, that's the bloke. And then I found out more about him. And he'd come back suffering dreadfully, but he'd also been sprayed with Agent Orange. And he was riddled with cancer, riddled with it. And he said, basically, and I went there, and one day I went to a festival, a gardening festival in Brisbane, and suddenly this bloke was standing next to me and said, I'm Mike, right? And I said, oh, I'm so pleased to meet him. And we talked, right? And then we went to the what they call the green room and had a discussion, and he had with him a woman who was his doctor. And suddenly he started to tell me about his experiences in Vietnam, of a battle. And he poured out, and he was weeping while he was telling me this, how his friends were killed, this appalling nightmare experience. And afterwards, his doctor said to me, oh, thank God you talked to him. That's the first time ever I've ever heard what it was. It's been locked up like a festering sore in there. And that was happening probably with your dad, right? I've been through the identical experience with my father, who was in World War I. exactly the same as a 6-year-old, lying stiff in bed, listening to your mother being bashed, and the screams and the shouts and the agony of it all. You know, yes, I've been there, right, and it's something that they say that suffering ennobles, and it does strengthen you, but you've got to be strong to get through, you know, that's the thing.
Thanks, Brett. Look, I might just say, it sounds tokenistic in response to this, but there is a push on, especially amongst younger veterans, to get an extra minute of silence at this year's commemoration. It's probably too late for Anzac Day, but maybe for Remembrance Day, to recognise the damage done to families and to those who return, because we only remember the fallen, but we don't remember the injured who came home mentally, physically. So there's a big push to get that awareness out into the community. So it might sound tokenistic, but actually could be very symbolic if we actually
You probably will get it through, do you think? That?
Yeah, the RSL are interested. We're working with other groups to try and
because you get massive public support.
Yeah, I think so. So there is a push on, and like I said, you know, I'm trying to get an inquiry up into this thing, exactly what you're talking about, Bob, because it's happening with young veterans. Up to 3,000 are living on the streets with mental illness, homeless, recent veterans, young veterans. The suicide rates are off the charts. We're still sending them off to war, and we can't look after them when they come back. I've got to say, within the Green Movement, I have been trying to reach out and get people to think about commemorating some way or another on Anzac Day, and there are a lot of people who are quite jaded by what's happened in the last 12 months. $135 million been allocated of our money to promote Anzac and what Anzac means, and I do say to them, actually, it's a critical opportunity for you to think, put aside some time on that day to think about peace. Not about war, but about peace. And the last thing I'd say to you is we'll still have an ongoing debate in the Senate to try and get the government to consider a war powers legislation, which actually makes Parliament vote on sending a country to war and sending troops to deployment. Because at least that way, firstly, we get to debate it, because at the moment it all goes on behind closed doors. And secondly, it's on every politician's conscience that they voted for or against a war. And if you think back to Iraq and how terribly that's gone, and what that's unleashed in the Middle East in the last 5 years, it'd be good to have each individual politician knowing where they sat when they stare at their ceiling at night time before they go to bed, how they voted on it.
There was one officer named Siegfried Sassoon. He was a Jew, he was gay, was one of the first prominent people to come out as a gay man. He'd been through the war, he won a military cross at the Battle of Mametz. He was a man of enormous courage, but he hated the war. He hated every bit of the war. And then, like many returned soldiers in 1919, he's looking around at so-called normality. People were going their separate ways, people were going and enjoying themselves, and it was almost as that 4 years of absolute desolation and bloodletting and slaughter had never occurred. And he wrote a poem about it, which I thought and still think is probably one of the most powerful anti-war poems I've ever read, and also, at the same time, one that's extraordinarily appropriate to this time of the year when we're talking about these things, and about Anzac and Anzac Day. And this was the poem, and he called it Aftermath. And this is how it goes. Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have rumbled on since those gag days, like traffic checked while at the city ways. And that haunted gap in your mind is filled with thoughts that flow like clouds in the lit heaven of life. And you're a man reprieved to take your peaceful share of time with joy to spare. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember those dark days when you held the sector at Mametz? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the frontline trench, and dawn coming, dirty white and chill, with a hopeless rain. Do you ever stop to ask, will it all happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack? And the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then, as you peered at the gaunt and haunted faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases, lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads? Those ashen grey masks of the lads who were once young and keen and gay? Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget.